In the 1600s, I believe this was a professor of the Catholic Church, had written a paper about the great error in the Quran, the great historical error in the Quran. And that refers to, the Pharaoh and Moses. Well, Pharaoh in the Quran tells one of his ministers, whose name is Haman, okay, he tells him to build him a tower so he may reach the God of Moses and, to discuss with him. Now, this occurs about 4 or 5 times in the Quran. Haman is mentioned a total of 6 times in the Quran. When Christian and Jewish scholarship came into contact with this passage, the criticism was, first of all, there's no Haman mentioned in the Bible in association with the Pharaoh. Second of all, he has been mentioned in the book of Esther under the king Xerxes in the story of the Tower of Babylon, the Tower of Babel, the famous story. And this is 1,000 years after Moses. So it's a completely different historical era where Haman, and that man Haman has been mentioned as building a tower. So the obvious alleged error was that Muhammad, ma'adallah, may have confused these stories that he was kind of getting from the Christians and Jews and kind of mixed them together and presented this. The coherence of the Quran, the cohesion of it as a text is the ultimate proof to the contrary. But just on that historicity point, Maurice Bucquois, it's about 70 years ago that he engaged in this study. He said, well, Jewish history contradicts what the Quran is saying about Haman and this tower building. Let's look at Egyptology. Let's look at Egyptian history. Because the French and the Germans at the late part of the 1800s had already started translating or getting into Egyptian hieroglyphics and reformulating the language to try to translate some of the ancient Egyptian texts. Egyptology was a big deal in the early 1900s even. So he travels to speak to some of these Egyptologists, says to them the Quran has this name, Haman, as a minister working for the historical Pharaoh at the time of Moses, that specific Pharaoh. Egyptologists tell him, and this is actually articulated in his book, The Bible, Quran, and Science, that there's no way this man could have known that name, and it's not even going to be there because that language, the Egyptian hieroglyphic language, was already dead for a couple of thousand years. Nobody knew that language. After translation, he goes to Austria and finds out there's actually a list of people that worked in the court of Pharaoh. They find Haman as the chief architect. That's actually found in Egyptology, a name mentioned in the Quran. So from the historical point of view, last comment on this issue of the miraculous nature of the Quran claims, Inna nahnu nazzalna dhikr. We are the ones who have revealed the ultimate reminder.
We meaning?
God himself. He speaks of himself in the royal. And he says we've made the Quran easy for remembrance. We've made the Quran easy for remembrance. This is a statement occurred multiple times in the Quran. To this day, the only book that, to my knowledge, that is memorized by hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people of all ages, despite their language background, by the letter, from one end of the book to the other, is the Quran without photographic memory. I don't have photographic memory. I just started learning Arabic in 2000. I've already memorized half the Quran. And this is part-time endeavor. In Chicagoland, probably you'd find a couple of hundred kids that have easily memorized the entire Quran. In China, you'll find kids that have memorized, adults that have memorized Quran. So the fact that the Quran says that it's miraculously easy to memorize, a 600-page document, miraculously easy to memorize, and it's memorized by people from all over the world to the letter, in and of itself is a miracle.